Hello, this is my review of the new Commodore C64 Reloaded MK2 board done by individual computers. I've got this board just a couple of days ago, and what I've done so far is I run the board through a couple of tests, a couple of different configurations to see whether everything is working, and as a first conclusion I can say that almost anything works on the board. I just found some minor issues here and there, but you probably will face the same issues with normal C64 boards as well, but more about this later. What you can see, obviously it looks different compared to a normal C64 board. If you take for example the 469 board revision, which looks like this, it is obviously a very different board, so to say. What's similar is that the main chips, like the CIAs, the CPU, the VIC2 and the SIDs, they are the same like on the older C64 boards, but in terms of technology this is really a huge difference, and you see less bigger chips on the board because most of the functions are combined in a couple of chipsets, and it is not this old TDL Technic style board anymore. In terms of layout, it still remains the same. So you got your control ports on this side, you got your switch, your power connector, more of this later. You got your video port, you got your IEC port, you got your tape port, the user port and the expansion port. Everything is in the exactly same position, no issues with this, and therefore the board fits without any changes, without any modification into a normal C64 housing, whether it's a breadbin or the new desktop style. So what's different, especially for this board? There's already a S-video connector as well as a 3.5mm audio jack connector on this board, so it is ready to use for TV sets with S-video connection, for example, or if you use an S-video to HDMI converter, then you can hook up your converter to this connector already. I've done this on this board by myself, so here's a so-called modulator replacement, and this is my test board, so most of the ICs are coming in sockets, so I can easily change them. Not as easy as on the MK2 board, you just have to push the lever and then you can replace your chipsets. Here I need this classical screwdriver approach, and what's an obvious difference as well, you do not have this classic ROM chipsets like on the older C64 boards. So that's the kernel ROM usually on this place, and the basic character ROM in this section are combined in 2 chips. On all the boards you have 3 chips for this. So here it is already replaced with a different kernel. So here it is done by the main chipset, so you can upload ROMs to the board and switch ROMs like you can do with other kernel changer as well. So the keyboard connector is just here above the CR. So in terms of location it's perfectly fine, because Commodore tend to change it on the board position anyway, but having it in this place it's okay, nothing to complain about. And what's an obvious difference is that you have a different power connector. So the MK2 is using this normal 5.5mm plug, whereas the old 64 having this standard DIN connector. And this is on the one side it's good news, but it has some minor bad taste as well. So you're required to use a different power supply, and that's something I really support, because the older power supplies, especially the bricky ones for the C64, they're prone to fail, and quite often if they fail, if they're going to die, they raise the voltage, and therefore there's a risk that they kill your board. And I had some of them which just died very silently, so they just switched off, for example. But I already had one that started to increase the voltage, and this can be a very slow process. This can happen quite suddenly, so you're not really have any warnings or something like this. You may recognize that your sits started to sound a little bit strange because they got too much voltage, they got too hot, or the picture has changed because the VIC started to overheat. But this is really something, if you pay attention to the details, then you may recognize this, but usually you didn't. So changing the power supply is more a logical step forward. And the small bad news is that actually you can't order a matching power supply at individual computers. It was announced, and I was really looking forward, and I was hoping that they get it done. But I don't know, whatever reason, you can't order it right now. But they have a recommendation. The board comes with a kind of flyer like this, and you can check on www.c64.de/tech. You get the same information as a PDF, for example, and all the details are on the web page as well. And here they recommend a certain power supply, so they recommend to have it 2 ampere DC 12 volt 5.5 whatever thingy. And so I got one from Amazon, and the good information, I think the good news is that most of the external hard disk power supplies, or even for certain Wi-Fi router, the power supply, this power supply will work as long as it is in the 12 volt DC range, having plus in the middle, and having just a small amount of EC left in the DC part. So they recommend having less than 0.1 volt of ripple, so to say, left in the DC signal. And I put mine through a couple of tests with the usage of my small oscillator, and it worked fine. So I'm happy that I found a working power supply, and this shouldn't be an issue at all. If you get one, or if you still have one that has a little bit more AC in the DC part, you may hear a small humming noise if you attach this to your stereo set or to your TV set. And if you recognize this, then you may look for a different one. But as long as you do not exceed the 12 volt by a major increase, then everything will work fine. That's not an issue. So what I've done so far, I'm just going to turn the board around. What I've done so far during the last day is I've tested it with a couple of different modules. The first reloaded MK1, which was just called reloaded, had certain issues running a couple of different cartridges. So I got one for myself about 6-7 months ago, and I sold it because I couldn't run the cartridges I was using at this time. And this hasn't changed that much, the usage I mean. I'm not sure about the board. Anyway, so the first thing I was looking for is whether Messiah is working or not. So the first reloaded board had issues running Messiah, and therefore I was really looking forward whether this board works with Messiah, because I want to use this as the board for one of my music C64s, and therefore this is really, for myself, it's really required to run with Messiah. The good news is, as I told, it runs with Messiah, it's no problem, and you can configure the SIDs to the certain addresses Messiah is requesting, and everything works fine. Talking about SIDs, as you can see, you got 2 SID sockets on the board, and this means that you can run 2 SIDs, obviously, and you can run them either in mono mode, so it's either SID 1 or SID 2 playing. You can run them in stereo mode, so you have a different address for the second SID, or you can run them in a mode where both SIDs are playing the very same stuff, and you have it SID 1 on channel left and SID 2 on channel right. You can change it as you like as well, and this is very interesting interesting. Sorry. If you want add some fullness or some more presence to your sound, so to say. Talking about modules, I have tested, as I said, the Messiah card. I've tested the Czech 64 card. More to this later. I've tested the 1541 Ultimate 2 Plus. I've tested the Ultimate 2 as well, so it's not just the Plus version. I've tested the Easy Flash 3, it's working fine, and I've tested the Lukash card, that works. I've tested the Action Replay 6, it works. I've tested the Synth card, I have to say something to this as well, and I've tested a couple of older game cartridges as well, so the C64 game system cartridges working as well. So I do not expect major issues with other cartridges. Talking about the synth card is something I'm using to make music as well, in combination with a Untitled MIDI card and an expander, so to say, having 2 slots and an expansion port. The synth card in this configuration, the synth card as a cartridge, requires the second SID to be at DF00 address, and actually it is not possible to configure the board to use this address for the second SID. Basically, I can't understand this, because even if it's an odd address for certain people or certain systems, it is widely supported by other dual SID versions like the Mix SID or the SID FX. All those versions are coming with this address, and as I said, it is actually not possible to run synth card in the dual SID mode on this board. What you can do is put both SIDs on the same address and run it in mono mode, so to say, or pseudo stereo mode, and it will add some fullness to the sound as well, but it's not the same like running synth card on a stereo setup. But fortunately there is a solution for this as well. So what I've done is I'm using the Kerberos card, which is a flash cartridge combined with MIDI, and I've put synth card on the Kerberos card because there is a special version for the Kerberos card, since the MIDI ports they need a certain address as well, and therefore Paul has created a different synth card version which is using a different address, and therefore with synth card on the Kerberos cartridge I'm able to use synth card in stereo SID mode. So for me, for my requirements, it is a perfect solution. It works fine, I have no issues with this. But it is quite odd that you can't use the DF00 address for the second SID. Messiah is requiring DE00, so that's fine. That's you can configure this, and Messiah is detecting the second SID without any problems. I ran a couple of tests using the sequencer and the monosynth. Everything works fine, so no issues with this. The pedals are working on the control ports as well. The 1351 mouse is working as well, no issues. So for your Messiah users out there, this is really that works without any issues. So just getting rid of this stuff a little bit to have some more space on my table. What I've done so far is using the Check64 module or cartridge, whatever you want to call this, and I run this board for a couple of tests with different chipsets. So what I have on this board right now is the older chipset, so it's 6510 CPU, as well as the 6569 VIC2 chip, and the CIAs are all the time 6526. There are some rare versions with 85 chipsets, but I haven't seen them so far. I do not own them, so I'm using the 6526 CIAs all the time, either in the non-A version or even in the A version. It won't make any difference for the C64 because it runs on 1 MHz only, and the A revision is able to crank up to 2 MHz, which isn't really a feature you really need. But I can tell you that every combination I was testing was working. I have just one CR which was not able to run in a certain combination, so having it on CI1 port and having different CIAs on port 2. I had some bad readings with Check64, but it is I think a faulty CIA. They're prone to fail, as I said, so it is a little bit strange that they remain original on the board. So in my opinion, talking about PLA and CIA, the PLA is more likely to fail but easier to replace. There are a couple of PLA replacements out there, and this is not really an issue, and they are pretty cheap as well. So if you go for the Philips, the PS100, whatever it's called, it is less than $10 or something like this, so it's not a problem. But the CIA tend to fail quite often, especially the one on the right side, which is now on the left for you, because of the control ports and the expansion port. If you tend to change joysticks and all that stuff, even in switched on mode, you're likely going to kill the left, the right hand CIA sometimes, whereas the CIA2 is mostly involved in handling the user port and all that stuff, tape port and other things, and usually they last even longer. But in my opinion, the next logical step, if you really go for the next evolution of the board, would be to replace those chips as well, just to keep the CPU, the VIC and the SIDS as original parts. But then you're getting closer and closer to the FPGA boards, which kind of just emulate the C64. Anyway, I've tested a couple of combinations. Everything was working except for the faulty CIA, and so you can combine whatever chipset you want. So you can run it on an old VIC chip having a new CPU, or vice versa. It's no problem having a newer CPU and the old VIC. It's done to your taste. It's no issue. And you can combine different zip chips as well. So I have ordered this board equipped with two 8580 zip chips, but for testing and for making music, mostly I'm using the 6581 R4AR chipsets. And you can easily mix this. It doesn't matter whether ZIT1 is the old or the new one. It really makes no difference. And in terms of behavior, I haven't seen any differences at all. So if you change the CPU, it doesn't matter at all. CPU is CPU, either it's the old or the new model. But changing the VIC chip makes a visual difference. So what I've seen is that especially the older VIC has a very special appearance. So the newer VIC is much clearer in terms of picture, in terms of colors. So a white is a white and a blue is a blue, and lines and letters and all that stuff. It's really straight and fine. There's no distortion, nothing like this. But I've tested the board with two older VIC chips, with the 6569, and you see that the colors are kind of washy, and the lines and the borders are not as straight as with the 85, 65, 69 and 65, I'm sorry. So if you're looking for a very crisp, very clear visual appearance of your picture, then I recommend running the 8565 rig chips, especially in combination with the S-video port. But if you look for a real vintage feeling, vintage appearance, then I recommend running the 6569 VIC2 chip on the board. And if you really are in hardcore vintage gaming or whatever, then you can even use the composite video connector as well, which is something I usually do not recommend, but for the sake of it, especially if you're running the board on a new TV set, which is just too good for having a C64 to it connected, then you may get some old style feeling back by using the old VIC and the composite output. But if you're really looking for a, well, let's say emulator-like picture quality, then go for the 8569 VIC chip and the S-video connector. So what else I need to say? In terms of stereo SID configuration, almost everything is possible. That's not an issue. So you can run both SIDs in parallel, having one on channel left and one on the other channel. You can switch them as well, just down to your taste, it's no problem. You can configure the second SID being at a different address. So if you run stereo songs or stereo demos, then you can configure the second SID to be on D42, D420, I'm sorry, as well as on different addresses, D500 for example. And then you have a real 6-channel stereo setup. So you can configure if you run the SID chips in stereo or mono mode. So it's either one playing or both playing at the same time. And you can configure the power switch, which has 3 states. It's off, it's on, and it's a 3-state here, to switch between 2 SID configurations, which makes it quite handy to have the board in a case and just to switch between mono and stereo mode, for example. What else? The one major thing that kind of makes a difference compared to other C64 boards is the USB connector here. So it's a mini USB, and you need this to configure the board. So out of the box, if you just put your chips on and everything is working fine, you're probably not going to configure anything on the board except for the stereo SID configuration. You can't do this right now by using a C64 program or something like this. You really need to attach the board to your PC or Mac, and then you need a terminal emulation program to access the board and have some configurations on the board. You can use this for diagnostics as well. So if you connect the board to a power supply and you switch it on, you have a small LED here, and it just lights up with a green light and switches off. And if it does so, everything is fine. If not, I can show you how it looks like. If you just remove a CPU, switch it on, it starts to blink and it tells you something is going wrong actually. So the good thing is you can't break something, so everything is designed the way that you can't do anything wrong, except you turn the chips the wrong way or something like this, or you mix it, I don't know, I haven't tested this. And but as soon as everything isn't working as expected, the green LED is flashing, and you can use the terminal connected to USB to check what's going wrong. So the terminal emulation is saying perhaps the CPU isn't detected, or the VIC isn't detected, or something like this. And even if you replace the SID chips by SwinSID nanos, for example, they are not detected because they behave different. They can't access by reading, so they do not behave like a normal SID chip. They just play the sound they're supposed to play, but they do not interact in any way. So even the pedals aren't working, for example. So the board keeps telling you that the SID isn't detected, but since the SwinSID nanos are able to run on 9 volt as well, like the 8580 SIDs, and this is the safe voltage for detecting the chips, the SwinSIDs are working, even if the board keeps telling you something is wrong. And therefore you can use the terminal emulation to check what's going on with my board. This is quite, let's say, a geeky feature. So in terms of having 80s, 90s computer movies in mind, The Hackers or something like this, it is very techy to connect the board via USB and having your terminal and typing commands and doing things. But in terms of, let's say, daily usage, it is a little bit cumbersome, so to say. The port is accessible from the outside, even if the board is placed into a normal C64 case. But if you keep changing your sound setup, for example, if you need to configure the SID on different addresses, if you really jump around between different stereo configurations or something like this, it is kind of essential to have the board connected to USB all the time. But the problem is, I can show you this, if you connect the board to USB, your tape port is blocked. And if you're a tape fan like I'm using the Tapeouino, for example, to run tape emulations, or I'm running the real data set to copy old tapes to preserve them, then you can't connect your tape any longer. So you need to replace the USB connector, and then you can put in your tape port. And this is really a little bit cumbersome, and I hope there will be probably a program or something like this to do this via the C64 itself, like the SID-FX card, the SID-FX dual SID mod is using this too. So in terms of compatibility, I said anything so far with modules. I've tested a couple of different ICs without any problems. I run a lot of different programs and demos and games on it, so Edge of Disgrace and Deus Ex Machina, all those Wonderland demos, everything is working fine. I haven't seen any issues so far. So I expect the board to work on almost every configuration you have found so far and behave the same like a normal C64. In terms of SID configuration, dual SID and all that stuff, I will have another video where I compare different solutions actually available on the market, and then I will compare the price tag as well. Just one final message: if you use the board for making music, for example, I've tested it to see whether it has a different signal to noise ratio. From a new board like this, I expect that the signal to noise ratio is better than compared to the older boards. I have seen this on especially the 425 board. They tend to be a tad noisy, especially the older chipsets tend to be noisy. And so I was really looking forward to whether the board has an improved performance. And what I've done so far, I've added the synth card program, and using the 8580 as well as the 6581 SID chips, and checked whether the noise, the idle noise, is different compared to a 469 board, for example, using a mixed SID. And surprisingly, I have to say that especially with certain presets of the synth card, there is less noise, less idle noise of the board. And just to give you some numbers, usually if you have the synth card attached and the C64 is running and synth card is not playing any tone at all, you have some idle background noise, kind of a high pitching typical computer noise at around -50, -52 dB, which is barely noticeable when you do some, let's say, louder music like techno music or something like this. Nobody will recognize this. But if you go for ambient music, where you have some kind of silent sections, and if you have some lower drone sounds, for example, then you can hear this quite clearly. And especially having the C65, the 6581 SID chip on it, it is louder in terms of idle noise. And running the synth card on this board with having two 6581 R4AR chips on it, it was kind of surprised to see that the idle noise is about -5 dB lower compared to a normal C64 board running a mixed SID. And if you have seen one of my other videos, you know that I have connected the mixed SID directly to the 3.5 stereo audio jack, so I'm not routing the signal through the board. So it is really the pure signal coming from the SID chips. And so it's really a nice feature to see that the idle noise is lower on this board. It does not apply for all of the presets on the synth card. So for some presets I haven't seen a difference, or the difference wasn't big enough. But especially for the arpeggiator presets, you can see a difference of about -5 dB, or 5 dB is just the difference. And if you keep in mind that about 6 dB is half or double the volume, then we talk about almost half of the background noise compared to the normal C64. Okay, so that's all so far. As I said, there will be a next video talking about different dual SID or double SID solutions available, and I will talk about using the board using for music as well, and about the price tag, for example. So for first impression, I think that's enough. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. And if you like my videos, or if you just want to be informed about the next videos, feel free to subscribe. Thank you very much.